security challenges, two-front war, external states, a China, a Pakistan, the traditional format. I am suggesting that when we look at the nature of the terrorist challenge, particularly the state-sponsored variant, the external and the internal overlap and the nature of the challenge for India is to acquire such capacity that would allow it to deal with this very, very complex phenomenon. The other proposition I wish to make is, Dr. Kalam is very, very particular about his choice of words. Very rarely does he use a strong word. And today, when he was speaking this morning, he used the word curse. It's not a word that he normally uses. He spoke about terrorism as a curse and how we need to acquire appropriate capacities. I am going a step further and suggesting that when we talk about this phenomenon, the word non-state is often used. In my own writings, very often, after 9/11 particularly, we all spoke about the non-state entity. I am submitting for your consideration that when we talk about what India is experiencing, India's experience of this phenomenon of terrorism is very distinctive. It has no parallel with any other part of the world. And the use of the word or phrase non-state is misleading. Because what India is dealing with, and as I said, from October 1947 onwards, is to extend the formulation made by Mr. Datta, a very, very inflexible orientation of where the Pakistani state and one part of the Pakistani state, the so-called establishment, not just the military or the army, which has this inflexible orientation, anti-Indian orientation, is constantly abetting, supporting, and where possible, even entering the Indian state and society to further its so-called strategy of supporting terror and acts of violence against India. And I think, to me at least, this is a central reality. And therefore, the word non-state becomes a bit misleading that India is dealing with this. And I also believe, and I say this with a lot of regret, after a few trips to Pakistan that I have made, talking to their academics, their analysts outside and within the subcontinent, that the space in Pakistan itself for rational thinking, for what you might call as the dissenting view, a part of Pakistan that does not see itself purely in this anti-India and what you now see, the societal changes that are taking place in that state and society, the interpretation and practice of Islam, which is becoming increasingly both distorted and violent, that the space for the rational, the liberal, and those who might share the kind of thinking that Mr. Datta just mentioned about God speaking in certain languages on certain days of the week, that is the reality that I witness and come across in Pakistan. So therefore, I am suggesting that for the foreseeable future, 10 years, 15 years, unless there is some very tectonic changes that can be brought about, this is a problem whose contours are going to become more virulent as far as India is concerned, and therefore the need for us to acknowledge this reality. I mean, this is the first part of outlining the nature of the problem and a suggestion that we must have some consensus, not just in Delhi. We need a consensus in every other part of India, whether it is Mumbai, whether it's Hyderabad, whether it's Bangalore, or in Shillong. India has to look at this problem collectively and with some degree of consensus. The problem might be different in Calcutta from what it might be in Srinagar, but I think there must be some consensus about the nature of the challenge. That having been said, the other reason why I keep saying non-state is misleading is that if we look at whatever be the name of the group, the Al-Qaeda, the Lashkar, the Jaish, and I'm only confining myself to the spectrum at this point, even if we acknowledge that the Pakistani establishment is providing this support to these entities, my greater anxiety and deeper concern is that it is not just Pakistan alone, but the major powers are also culpable. Meaning thereby that whether it is the United States and its policies towards this part of the world, going back to the 50s, from the time of General Ayub Khan onwards, or the policies of China, as two examples of the major powers, have initiated, have embarked on policies that have been detrimental, and this is yet another reality that we have to accept when we look at the nature of the challenge. And this is where I think there is some cause for anxiety about the response of the Indian state. And I say this in a very apolitical manner. I have no axe to grind. But my own reading is that from NDA, when we had Mr. Vajpayee as the Prime Minister, to UPA 1, Dr. Manmohan Singh, and now UPA 2, with the change of the coalition, has not been able to exude that kind of directivity that you want from the state. I have spent, as I said, a large part of my life as an analyst outside the system, so perhaps I may not be aware of much of the thinking at the highest levels, but as an observer, as a pathologist, as I said, as an analyst, there is a sense that over the last, when I say India was reactive, India was episodic, that we have not been able to acquire that directivity in the policies that we seek. And I think when Mr. Datta talks about resolve, perhaps it's an allusion to the same inadequacy in our larger framework. But if the nature of the challenge is so distinctive, it is so virulent, as I said, we are paying in blood. Mumbai, Pune, Kabul. Do we continue in the same way? Or do we step back, to use computer jargon? Do we reset and decide as to what would be the most optimum way? And here I keep reminding myself, when I feel a bit gloomy sometimes, and audiences like you, that India's resilience is actually quite extraordinary. Amongst the many distinctive features of India, if Mumbai came back soon after November 26th to the rhythms of normalcy, there are many parts of India which exude or exhibit the same kind of resilience. And I think we need to remind ourselves that when I say India is alone in this challenge in dealing with the scourge of terrorism, it seemed as if we were alone even in 1970 and 71. Figures vary, but those of you who remember the period 1970 to 71, we had anything between 6 to 8 million people of East Pakistan origin who came to this country. And the rest of the world, again for its own reasons, did not see the nature of the problem as India did. We prevailed. There were some false starts, but at the end of the day, we prevailed. It's a different matter that we were not able to maximize and get the right benefits out of this military victory, but that's another story. What I'm saying is that even today, despite the nature of the problem, and however intractable it may seem, that I think India can find the resilience if groups like this, with the kind of platforms that the Mumbai police are providing, are able to think this through. We won't get it right the first time, but I think we need to sit like this and come up with some options. And this is where I wanted to perhaps outline 3 or 4 points as to what is it that we can do, we as an India can do. I have disaggregated this at 3 levels. One is at the level of the state, the Indian state, the state of Maharashtra, the city of Mumbai, whatever be the nature of the hierarchy in which we have organized ourselves. The second is at the level of the non-state, whether it is the institutions in the private sector or anything that is not part of the government, academia, media, Bollywood, you name it, but the institutions that form this country. And finally, the individual, all of you who are sitting here. It doesn't matter whether you're Indian or not Indian, but individuals who reside in the subcontinent. And I am suggesting that we should first of all recognize omissions and inadequacies across these 3 levels: the state, the non-state entity, the institution, and finally, the individual. And I am suggesting that the inadequacies and omissions can be broadly brought into 2 words. One is ineptitude. Ineptitude meaning that you don't know how to do better. The second, I say again with candor and regret, turpitude. Meaning that there is a lowering of our levels of integrity, morality, to use another word, whether it is institutional, the Indian state, the Ministry of Defense,